Here we are starting with great power in the sunset years, and this is a chapter looking at the older age. Now, we're going to need to consider what are some of the dimensions of aging, because aging has certainly gotten to be quite a bit bigger area, a bigger demographic. So what can happen to lifestyles, family relationships as people age? Because since they're around a lot older and a lot longer, that means family changes somewhat too then. I wonder what the implications of that will be as people get older and stay around longer. And how do illness and death affect families? Now, illness and death isn't new to families, but because families are around longer and the quality of care and who cares for our family members as they start to get ill, and what are the implications of illnesses on the family dynamic and how it succeeds or how it progresses as a result of these conditions that affect family. How do different cultural groups deal with aging and death? We're going to consider that. And we're going to consider how do social policies affect families with older members in it. We're probably going through a particularly important period around social policy as it relates to the aging process. With more and more old people growing older and that population size getting bigger, is our healthcare system able to provide support to that large number? What other options might there need to be? So this is the chapter we're looking at. I hope you enjoy it.
Now, when we look at the older age, the popular myth about the elderly can be misleading. The time clock for becoming older is less clear-cut than it used to be, but it does still exist. Old age is becoming redefined. Rather than one group, experts now see three groups of older people. There's the young old, that's people between the ages of 65 and 74. There's the old, that's people from 75 to 84. And then the old are people who are 85 and older. Society recognizes several aspects of becoming older. You can look at these different dimensions. There's chronological, and chronological just means the number of years old you are. And many people who write about old age use 65 as the starting off mark. And in fact, 65 is a relatively new standard, and it used to be younger, but there it is. Well, we can also look at our physicalness and how are men and women viewed as they get older. There are gender and class differences in how physical changes are regarded. Some of the social scientists suggest that old age begins when physical disability sets in. And we can look at white hair, we can look at wrinkles. There's a number of other elements that we might consider some of the physical shifts and changes. Psychologically, or the state of mind that a person has, you're only as old as you feel is one sort of expression about the psychology of being old. Believing that aging is a frame of mind, it is difficult to find qualities that are characteristic of most elderly. There's such a wide variation of how people feel about being old. They show more differences than similarities, as do younger people. And then socially, how we are supposed to act, the cultural norms of being old, timing of markers, events such as grandparenthood, widowhood, and retirement are changing. Attitudes towards timing changes are not unanimous. That is to say, are we all prepared for getting older and getting older in the time frame and the expectations the way that it seems to play out now? When we think on developmental tasks, there is key tasks for older people to accept still a shift of roles, that is in terms of what sort of things they can be a part of and what are things they participate in, and allow the next generation to take over leadership in private and public sector life. As individuals reflect on their lives, they look at the order and the meaning of things. Without a sense of that life has some meaning or purpose, people can sink into despair. A few differences and adjustments to old age between homosexual and heterosexual men and women. There's very few differences. So when we look at these developmental tasks, we can consider one being independence versus dependence, the ability to remain independent related to both financial status and physical and mental condition of the older individual. Home ownership often allows seniors to maintain their independence. Homeowners significantly are less likely to be institutionalized than those who rent. Living in a nursing home greatly reduces independence. In 2012, 200,000 Canadians, relatively few, lived in residences for the aged. When we look at connectedness versus separateness, the struggle for independence often reflects tension between desire for connectedness and separateness. Older people value relationships with their children and their grandchildren, yet also wish to maintain their own unique lifestyle. And then lastly, we have openness versus privateness. And here's where, privacy becomes very precious in the face of retirement and widowhood and sickness and institutionalization. Some find it preferable to obtain care from a stranger than from a family member. If someone is cared for by a relative or living in a nursing home, a private life is virtually impossible. So statistically, when we look at population of Canada, we know that it's becoming older. It's becoming older because people are living longer. Oldest members of the baby boom bulge have started to retire and are swelling the number of seniors. Since birth rate is down, fewer younger Canadians to offset this increase among the elderly. According to Stats Can, seniors age 65 and older account for a record high of 14.8% of the population in Canada in 2011. That's up from 13.7% 5 years earlier. The census of 2011 counted 5,825 people aged 100 years and older. That's up from 4,635 in 2006 and 3,095 in 2001. Of the nearly 5 million seniors aged 65 and over in 2011, over half, 56.4%, were part of couples. That is, they were married or still are living together. 24.6% lived alone. 11% had other arrangements such as living with relatives, and then the remaining 7.9% lived in nursing homes or residences for senior citizens. Between 2001 and 2011, the proportion of senior women who lived alone declined, while the proportion of senior men living alone remained relatively stable. So when we look at this older population, it's much more complex and more diverse than we at first maybe thought. Now, when we think in terms of economic factors in the aging of Canada, in Canadian retirement income, there's three basic pillars. There's the government public pension for those 65 and older. Even if not retired, there's a guaranteed income supplement if individuals had little or no other retirement income. And then the second pillar would be Canadian Pension Plan or the Quebec Pension Plan, CPP and QPP. These are payments based on how much the individual contributed to his or her own lifetime of working. So the more you have been working, the more CPP or QPP you'll have available when you retire. And then the third pillar is private pensions and savings. This is if you worked for a company and you paid into a pension plan, like the teacher's pension plan, for example, or if you have gathered RSPs or other pensionable savings. Still many inequities in pensions. Women are most disadvantaged. The factors involved here is that women are more likely to have been working part-time, usually not work as many years as men, and may take time off to care for children. More women than men work in service occupations where there is no pension, and women often earn less money than do men doing similar work. The median retirement age has changed. In the 1970s to the early 80s, it was 65. By 1987, the government lowered minimum wage, at which one could draw benefits from 65 to 60, and by 2005, it was 61, and 2012, eligibility for old age security and guaranteed income supplement increase from 65 to 67. And so part of what the government is doing is adjusting for this larger number of older people who are eligible for income support, while there's less people who are working to provide the revenue by which to pay for that. Now, some other elements around aging in Canada is the kinds of activities and interests that people in retirement have. Retirement usually marks a major change in activities. Problem for people who define their value as individuals by their occupation is that when they retire, they often find it difficult to find things to do and how to fill their time. Most retirees, however, are happy and busy. Substitute active recreation is valuable. Time with friends is important. Caring for others, that is, a lot of older people care for other older people. And volunteer work for instead of doing paid work, or in some cases, for some people, even in retirement, they're still working. Working women may not feel as much displacement as men do, since many continue homemaking even in their retirement, just as they did when they were running their own, just as they did during their working years, Now, the health and self-care issues as people grow older, physical well-being and concerns about possible or actual illnesses become more important. Those over 75 are more likely to have a chronic health problem or disability. Most common are vision, mobility, and memory problems. Lower income individuals are at greater risk of illness and death than those with higher incomes. Greater access to medical attention, medicines, quality food has all contributed to that. A vast majority of seniors live in private households. Often overlooked are the number of seniors caring for others, a spouse, a friend, or even a neighbor. Caregiving of seniors often ends when the mental or physical health of the older person makes it impossible for a family to cope any longer. Whether seniors live in their own homes, with a child, or in an institution, family members, especially daughters, feel the duty of providing care. Even if there is other responsibilities such as children and a job, it's the daughters that tend to pick up the biggest responsibility. And as is sometimes the case in old age, is the experience of terminal illness. It can be very stressful for families, both for the dying person and his or her relatives must face the deterioration of the physical or mental powers of that person. The family has to prepare for the actual death for the changes that will occur in lifestyle and relationships. A lack of openness may affect the ability to talk about matters such as prolonging life once the quality of life has been destroyed. Funerals are families' times when all relatives gather together. Until funeral is over, family members often forget differences over assistance to one another. Continuing on, as much as it may not be a terminal illness, as people get older, they're more likely, of course, to die. In widowhood, initially involves a sense of loss and disorientation and loneliness. True for cohabitating and same-sex couples as well. Women who have centered their lives on their husbands and families often feel loss of an identity and status when losing a partner. For some, however, the death becomes as a relief. Examples, when one partner has suffered a long time or the relationship has been unhappy or abusive. Women tend to manage better than men after the death of a spouse. Men far worse because they have usually depended on their wives for emotional support. In the first year following death of a spouse, men more than women suffer an increase in death and suicide rates. Often death of a spouse means drop in income, and especially when the employed partner dies, and then most often that's the husband. Long-term hardships tend to be greater for women since they often have limited financial resources, for example pensions, and are less likely to find a new partner. When we think in terms of the couple relationship, a majority of older people live with a family member, usually a spouse. An increasing number of older women are divorced. Sexual relationships remain important in old age. Men more likely to remarry following death of a spouse or divorce of a spouse. more eligible women than men because men tend to die earlier, and adult children may actively discourage remarriage because they see it as a disloyalty to the deceased parent or because they're worried about their own inheritance. And unfortunately, that does play a role. Now, certainly as people get older and they have their siblings are often growing older with them. Most young old people have at least one living sibling. Quality of sibling relationships doesn't usually undergo dramatic changes as people age. Siblings' experience of growing up in the same family often draw them together. Illness and death of a parent may influence a sibling's relationships. Um, with retirement and empty nest, siblings often increase contact occurs. Sisters are closest, followed by brothers and sister pairs. Those who have never married and childless widows depend on siblings the most. Um, Most older people have at least one child with whom they are in touch. Closest relationships usually is between mothers and daughters. Married children not as close as parents as the divorced and separated, especially in the never married. Childless older people may have active social networks that take the place of children. When a partner is absent or unable to provide help, children often provide support. However, the parent-child relationship is not one-sided. When adult children have crises such as divorce or widowhood, or the birth of a child with health problems, parents are key supports and key providers of that support. As populations age, increasingly common for several generations is to know each other. Relationships between grandparents and grandchildren is considered special because it's not complicated by parental responsibilities. Grandchildren tend to be close to grandparents with whom their parents have a good relationship. Grandparents can have a positive effect on their grandchildren. Grandchildren are particularly important to young adult grandchildren who regard them as important sources of emotional gratification and conveyors of family history and traditions. Grandfathers tend to have less contact with grandchildren compared to grandmothers. Divorce has an impact on grandparents, and a number of step-grandparents is growing. Many grandparents provide care for their grandchildren. Grandparents, especially grandmothers, are more important childcare resources for working parents, either for the whole day or through part of the day. And school, 1 in 5 children receive such care. Grandparents face several challenges when they take over childcare. They lack the immediate energy. The grandchildren may have suffered from family breakup and have emotional baggage. They often are not recognized as legal guardians. For immigrant families, cultures differ greatly in views regarding how responsible and middle generation should be for the elderly. Certain ethnic groups have strong beliefs about not abandoning relatives in nursing homes. Other people may feel isolated and shame both because because they're away from their family and community and because elders are traditionally cared for within the family. Nursing homes designed for specific ethnic groups help reduce the feeling of being cut off from one's culture. Recent immigrants are more likely to live in three-generation households than those born in Canada, especially those from Asia and Latin America. Elderly immigrants living and aging in Canada face many challenges: language barriers, disappearance of traditions and social networks, and inability to access economic resources. When they do join their children in Canada, elders leave behind familiar attitudes towards seniors and customary ways of life. Children may have adopted mainstream cultural norms, but older immigrants thus feel a little further displaced. With Aboriginals, currently Aboriginal children under the age of 6 are more likely to be living with a grandparent than non-Aboriginal children. Traditionally, grandparent generation among Aboriginal people was responsible for socializing children. In return, grandchildren had an honored responsibility of helping grandparents remain independent. The elder role has been eroding, though. and the coming of Christian missions and accompanying residential schools which removed children from their homes and cultures. During the 60s and the 70s, many children apprehended by child and welfare authorities were placed in non-Aboriginal foster and adoptive homes. Now the role of the family is taken on by the community through services such as home support of the elderly and on-reserve nursing homes. Recent renewal of interest in traditional Aboriginal ways has made a big difference. Elders once again valued as custodians and transmitters of traditional culture. The 2001 survey that found that about half of Aboriginal children living off reserves who could understand or speak the Aboriginal language had learned it from their grandparents. Currently, Aboriginal children under the age of 6 are more likely to be living with their grandparents than non-Aboriginal children. And so, I hope this has been a helpful lesson on aging and the sunset years. Thank you.